Hi, Jordan. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. I'm real good. It's been the first 4 or 5 weeks of October was rough because we had the hurricane here and everything got destroyed. But now we got potable water back finally, and yesterday, and so the infrastructure is more stable and things are moving and things have kind of definitely moved back to an ordinary pace. And you have the experience, like when you get sick, how just ordinary health feels very refreshing. It's like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So, how was that for your community? Like, what was that like?
Well, it was, the classic, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. So in some very important sense, it was quite devastating. People died, much property was destroyed, many lives were deeply impacted negatively, and the community pulled together profoundly. The way I described it, actually, at this gathering I did in Florida that Jonathan Pageau was at, was we stepped into reality. So under the duress of a real a real situation, we actually left the simulation and stepped into reality. And it's nice to be in reality. It's a reminder that reality is where we'd like to be all the time. And so again, it was, and everybody broadly speaking felt something like that. So it was a feeling of meaningfulness or richness, of connection, of commitment, um, aliveness. It mixed in, like very deeply intermingled with the horror and the sadness and the difficulty and the challenge.
It's kind of some of the things I want to talk about with you are the ways in which technologies. I had a podcast I did with someone on Bitcoin. He's actually an economist, but he's now starting a course on Bitcoin. And I bring that up because I think about these kinds of new technologies to. Sometimes I think about abstraction and then the world of technologies and kind of being able to speak even online to those of different people. On the one hand, it's super valuable and connects you to reality in a certain sense and expands it. But on the other hand, we're then using technologies to kind of resolve problems created by technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it feels like that. And so, but there's, maybe something different. There's a connection to reality, which is, expanding. Maybe it relates to kind of John Vervaeke's notion of there are two ways in which reality can feel more real to you. There's one which sort of it kind of confirms your belief. Oh yeah, this makes sense to me. It's there's I have more agency, or this scientific theory. I test the prediction. Oh yeah, it makes sense. Well, that's now I have this theory, this abstraction, and reality is now conforming to me. On the other hand, something which completely destroys your framework and worldview, a hurricane that you can't predict, is also like touching reality, precisely because you can't deal with it, and so in having to deal with it, you have
Uh-huh.
to regrip, and so there's a kind of conforming to reality in a different way. I mean, how long have you been Christian now? How did that change things?
A little over a year. How did it change things? Well, it changed things sort of practically quite substantially because I spent pretty much all my time with my church during this last month. Um, and I mean this both. Let me say, one, we'd wake up in the morning. I'd go walk or gather water to be able to flush toilets. I'd go get fresh water if we needed it, which pretty much every day we did. Then we would get into the car when we felt comfortable driving, and then we went to church. And then at church was the hub of where the activity was taking place for the crisis response. And so you'd go to the whiteboard, you talk to people, find out what kind of jobs you're going to do in that day, join whatever team you're going to be on, go out. And of course, you'd have like a gathering of children that were sort of being loosely managed by whoever was hanging out there. And so, my daughter would go into that environment, my wife would go into her environment, I'd go into my environment, and then we'd get together around 4, where we would have a family dinner and we'd usually have some worship. And so it was a completely different heartbeat, but the center of the heartbeat was in fact the church, the actual physical building and the body of the people. Which obviously that would not have been the case a little over a year ago because I wouldn't have been part of that church or any church. I probably would have left, to be honest. If I hadn't been part of the church, I probably would have just left and gone, somewhere and just lived somewhere for a while, for a month, or whatever. So quite significant. And then also there was the felt sense of let's say just why, right? So there's the where and the who and the what, but there's also the question of why. Like, why are we choosing to put our life energy into this? Why are people spending their money to support other people? Why are people coming in from all over the country and the world to volunteer their time, energy, skills, and resources to help? And that was, of course, also connected to the church. So in both cases.
It's interesting because, you know, you could always, as you say, I mean, you're like, this is too, you might want to leave. I mean, this is too difficult. What can I do here? But it's interesting. I notice even in a kind of globalized world where one can not even just move acutely because of a disaster, but even more generally, one can kind of move anywhere. And sometimes that we feel like moving somewhere will lead to something kind of new or different if I want to change or improve my life. But then on the other hand, it kind of means you can't, like, to stay where you are and then try and go, okay, I mean, something's gone wrong here, but actually there's some core, some foundation that's actually stronger that we'd actually, I mean, yeah, I mean, rebuild, but also build. I mean, craft and foster, right, and
Mm-hmm.
cultivate there, and then so why, and then why would you want to leave that? Uh, you talked to John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau about Christianity. So how have these conversations on Christianity with Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke kind of changed the way of thinking?
Well, these are different people. So the very um, my experience with let's go with my experience with Pageau for the moment, and I can extend it, by the way. I mean, obviously, in some sense, publicly, I've had conversations with Pageau and Vervaeke. I've also had a lot of private conversations with a lot of other people that many people might actually know who they are, but that we haven't shared our conversations. So, with regard to my conversations with Pageau, oh God, man, how do I even describe it? It's like, I mean, it's a little bit for me. It's a little bit like having a voice coach, right? So somebody who is just truly skilled in beauty, just in a way that is just at the very edge of disheartening, right? So he's so capable. He just understands and has such a deep, lived, embodied relationship. And by the way, I went to this event, this Art of Tamada event in Florida, where he was there and he brought his wife and his two daughters, or maybe two of his daughters. I don't know how many children he has. And so I got to experience not just him, but his whole family. And his whole family are Christians. And I mean this in the sense of not propositional. I mean participatory. They embody the sensibility of what Christ has invited us into powerfully. And so there's just an incredible richness. Like it's lovely. It's like for me, it's almost like a kid not even a kid in a candy store, but like going to grandma's house on Christmas. You're just going in and there's just so much good, rich possibility that is insightful. Like I know that I'll experience a deeper insight, and so it's just curiosity, but also it's heartening and it's grounding and it's also convicting. Like, oh man, I need to sit up straight and do better, like all that kind of stuff. So that's been that part of the experience. Um, that's a lot. So there's a whole lot there. I mean, I'm just kind of like waving
Yeah,
my hands
yeah.
vigorously. The conversations with John, let's say also say with Jim Rutt, have been beautiful in a different tone, right? Because John Vervaeke is a gentleman for whom I have deep love at a relational level. We've been interacting as friends now for 7 years, some meaningful amount of time. Um, you've gone through a lot of different interesting arcs in our individual lives, and he has his own personal specific relationship with Christ and with Christianity, which are not the same, and of course is brilliant, and I have a profound sense of respect and gratitude towards him for many things. And so this is an experience of actually practicing, right? There's a sharpening, like, okay, a lot of the ways that I'm thinking or think that I'm understanding are challenged properly, meaning, okay, if it's how do I say it right? Like, we're not fighting. Like, it's not a conflict. I'm not trying to convince him of anything. He's not trying to convince me of anything. It's rather we're both mutually participating in helping each other come into deeper, more intimate, more true, more clear relationship with the highest aspects of reality. And so it's intense. Right? There's an intensity to it that is, I think, for me at least, been very generative in ways that kind of orient more for me towards the soul. Um, Although, of course, towards the mind, but there's something about the soul direction that feels even more particular.
Tell me more about that connection to the soul. You know, it's interesting that you would find conversations with say Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke illuminating, because on the one hand you can kind of have someone that you intellectually converse with, and I told you I'm starting a PhD in economics, and you kind of want to battle out ideas, but there's some way in which when someone can kind of play with your idea and viewpoint and almost make it better and kind of go, it's, I think, it's funny, like listening to Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau talk about, like, and then they would kind of reflect on their conversation with Richard Dawkins, and it's kind of like, can we get Jonathan Pageau in the room, because I feel like you kind of need someone to understand Christianity, as you said, and then kind of living as a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and not just intellectually understanding it, and then say someone like Richard Dawkins, if you only look at Christianity from that propositional level, if you start off kind of cynical about it, almost going at it, trying to make fun of it. Like, if you want to make fun of Christianity and you go trying to do that, you will be able to do it and do an incredibly good job. But that initial stance, I say that loosely. It's like, okay, you could, and it will, on some level, you'll be
Well,
right in doing that.
There's a lot. So let's just, Dawkins came to my mind as well. So let's see. So let's see. What you'd like to see in a conversation, say with Dawkins, is for him to reconnect with his soul. I mean, my experience of him when I've actually watched, I only watched for a little bit because it was so evident that I was like, okay, that's that. Is that the gentleman actually believes in some, how do I say, not believes, but actually lives as if he does not have a soul, right? And he also believes that, but the point is he actually lives as if. It is not the case. It is false. It's profoundly false. And so therefore he's operating in the image I have is like this lollipop, like a skinny stick and this big old ball at the top, right? So he can't help but interact with, say, Christianity, but all of life through the intellect. And so he's got this hypertrophied intellect teetering on top of this desiccated and largely fragile soul. You can see the fragility, by the way, which does not enable him to actually engage with life. He can only engage with ideas about life. Those aren't the same thing. And therefore, of course, if he tries to engage with Christ by means of intellect, he's not engaging with Christ. He's engaging with ideas about Christ. And then he's playing with ideas disconnected from their real lived context, as if he's dealing with the actual real lived context. And so obviously it's absurd. It's absurd as a premise. It's already absurd the instance he grasps it in that way. The act of grasping it in that way is absurd and, by the way, tragic in its essence. So one of the things that Pageau is able to do reasonably well is he presences a soulfulness in his way of thinking. Like, he doesn't leave the presence of God when he is speaking. He does not speak intellectually, he speaks symbolically, which is to say he speaks in a way that throws things together, that brings things into communion with the divine. So he's not using words propositionally, he's using words participatorily. And an invitation to participate is a part of what he holds quite nicely. Now, one can always refuse an invitation, right? One can simply stand and say, no, I'm going to continue to stay in the arena of separation from soul. But the beauty, the fact that he's able to speak with such beauty has the allurement, right? One wants to engage with beauty in a way that is deeper than your mind, right? It connects with you at the level of soul profoundly, actually at the level of spirit profoundly. And so the invitation is quite attractive in a way that maybe actually doesn't necessarily make sense to the mind. But as you begin to engage, more and more beauty will result, and then truth will remember his proper place.
I remember recently trying to speak to my brother about, we were watching Alex O'Connor's recent video he was talking to two Christians, and one of the Christians kind of came in and started explaining the book of Genesis, and I was, watching with my brother, and he was like, I'm not listening now, because he's now talking about a book that I don't believe is real, as if it makes loads of sense that you would bring it up. But I kind of had to say, one thing I said was, if someone was telling you a scientific theory, you wouldn't just go, hey, I heard premise one, I don't like the sound of that, and then throw it in the bin. You'd have to kind of hear the whole story of the scientific theory, and then and then see what insight that gives you into the world, and then accept that on its own terms. So it's kind of like if someone lives in the world where Genesis to them makes sense, and they live in that, it doesn't just make sense. I mean, it helps them make sense of the world, right? Then you kind of have to hear how they say that, and you kind of have to. And I don't know though what one question I have is, how do you get someone to kind of, like Richard Dawkins say, to kind of engage with that on their terms, right? Like, could that conversation with Jordan Peterson and Dawkins kind of been better, such that will they ever be able to speak on those same terms?
I mean, it's tricky because I'm not sure that Peterson's the right guy for that conversation. And how do I say it right? Maybe to the degree to which Dawkins is acting as an expression or an avatar of a whole group of people, then maybe it's worthwhile even wondering, right? So part of me is like, why are we talking to Dawkins about any of this stuff? Like, he's sort of so far off his own territory. It'd be like talking with, I'm trying to think of a good example, like talking to Barry Weiss about geopolitics. Like, it makes no sense. Like, why would I do that? She has no idea what she's talking about. She may be able to produce something that sounds like opinions, but that's irrelevant. Like, why would I do it? So the same thing with Dawkins. Like, talking to Dawkins about religion is absurd. He has no idea what he's talking about at all. And isn't even capable of even having the level of conceptual rigor to address the problem. Like, there's just like 16 levels that you would have to actually spend the time to go through to have an honest conversation. And unfortunately, Peterson is not, I think, properly equipped to navigate that. So that's one question. But the real answer is simple, which is he would have to suffer tremendously and actually come to terms with the reality of life that is not living up in abstraction land, and actually be in a profound state of actual lived grief, which is to say he would have to go back into reality, right? Returning to our previous conversation, I think that was us talking about that. When we left our abstractions, like we left our cozy little lives in the Shire, with our what do you call it, noonsies, our second lunch, second breakfasts, and actually exited the Shire and went into reality and had to deal with evil and had to deal with the roughness of life and the presence of death and the fact of, by the way, also heroism, and then returned back to realize that in the absence of all of that, the Shire is not safe. Then, okay, so that's the reality. That's the actual reality. Like, life is vast. Reality is vast. This tiny, narrow precipice that is where he is sort of landed would have to break enough for him to re-expand into and recognize, for example, not just what the soul is, but in some sense, why the soul is. And for Zach Stein does a pretty good job there. That might be an interesting bridge. The notion of the pre-tragic, the tragic, and the post-tragic. There's a whole bunch about the concept of ensoulment that would just be useful, but hard for me to say. My general sense is you'd have to live it, not think about it.
Right. And it's like, well, probably Richard Dawkins has gone through difficulties, and maybe he does talk about the ways in which he doesn't want to just trivialize or think that the world is meaningless, but it's sometimes ungrounded because he wants to kind of like have his thing where only molecules and DNA exist and work, with the actual agents as sort of just being sort of vessels that carry the genes, and then sort of add on top, oh yeah, maybe there's these other things I care about. And because I think my conversation with DC Schindler was really interesting because we talked a lot about, one can be super claiming the world is super illusory and be kind of, and always sort of battle against something being true, but then you, in your lived experience, you treat people as meaningful and real, and you kind of have this sort of performative contradictions that emerge. And then it's sort of like, okay, well, then even just purely on an explanatory basis, what can ground that then, right? Like, we don't want to be living in a world where we kind of, because if we don't properly ground and understand these things on both the spiritual and an intellectual level, then you kind of you kind of slip into perhaps discarding concepts that you thought maybe superfluous, right? And then it's like, and then it's kind of sometimes feels like it's only it feels like a story of our culture. It's only a bit later on then you go, huh, actually maybe we shouldn't have
Shit.
done that thing.
Yes, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the classic load-bearing problem, right? You've dispensed with things that were unaesthetic, not recognizing that they're in fact load-bearing, and then you get away with it for long enough, maybe a generation, maybe two, maybe three, that you've forgotten any of the basis, and then when things start to collapse around you, you're like, huh, I wonder how that happened.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And the same thing, by the way, is true of life. So if you say this performative contradiction, this is in a person the cut flower problem that we see in the culture, right? So, for example, it is simply not the case that only Christians help other people. That's not the case. But a lot of the reasons why people in the West help other people is inertia. Right? A lot of the values that many people might express and might even say they're self-evident are not at all self-evident. Like if you actually run a rigorous analysis of the logical propositions that give rise to what their arguments are, they have actually no foundation whatsoever. And because they have no foundation, they are ultimately subject to the entropy of time that will break away that inertia, and they will find themselves dealing with madness and chaos and ugliness and nastiness. Um, Again, because they have undercut the foundations upon which these moral uh, intuitions actually rest.
I've been having this idea about what kind of thing science is, and it's probably not original. Like it feels original to me, but there's probably someone that's articulated it better than me. But what I've been thinking is that science, sometimes you can kind of think of it as a very long term project, in the sense that, if you were to like do the experiments where you really rigorously understand what an atom is and what fundamental particles are, then that kind of feels like something which is timeless, right? I mean, we zoomed into these tiny little things, and we can have experiments to, 5 decimal places. This is what is real, right? And I would agree. There's a part of it that is very real, very long term focused when we do that as a science, as a civilization. But on the other hand, I feel like, in part because it's an abstraction, it kind of in some ways it actually is a very it's kind of efficient but not resilient. In a way though. It works when we have all the conceptual grounding, all the other scientists working and understanding what these frameworks mean, what they're supposed to be trying to do. But again, I kind of want to contrast it with mythology, or try and understand what Jordan Peterson and other people think about mythology as. Again, you can kind of be like, well, this is a bit weird. What exactly does it apply to? Exactly. But then in a weird way, it's way more longer term. It can't say anything about something as specific and niche as an atom as useful, and then you might want to say that's not very good, because an atom's super useful to understand, and that's, like what amazing things can they, it do when we understand that. But then on the other hand, it's kind of like, uh, you kind of need things like stories and other ways to ground reality, so that you can have places for, because, again, what I mean, actually, then it kind of makes me think, I mean, to what degree is an atom real? I mean, it's made up of other smaller sub particles, and then, you
Well,
need an instrument to see it. And
this is the kind of the 16 layers deep problem. So we even have to we'd have to spend some time talking about what we mean by the word real. It definitely isn't governed by the precision of your instrumentality. That's not how we govern real, or that's not
well, I
what the
want to
word
just
means.
say, yeah, I want to say one thing is that real, as John Vervaeke says, is a comparative term. Some things are real in comparison to other things, right? So when I said, well, how is an atom real? I don't mean it's, if someone says the dream isn't real, that's compared to reality, waking up, oh, I see the dream was less real than the thing I'm waking up to. Doesn't mean the dream was completely illusory, though. Like, what would it mean to say some things are completely
Well, here
false,
you may be
other things?
equivocating between the concrete and
Mm,
perhaps maybe something happening at the level of the imaginal, um, which are, again, to be concrete doesn't mean to be real, or let's say more real. It just means to be more concrete to the degree to which the
mm,
qualities of relationality you're seeking are governed by the domain of concrete. Then you will find more reality. But if, by the way, the qualities of relationship you're seeking are governed by the imaginary, then the concrete is less real. So reality has to do with relationship. That's kind of the key insight here. Is that reality has to do with relationship, and relationship is a very complex thing. Um, there was another piece. There's so much, like just what you were saying just a moment ago. There's like a 10 or 11 things that we could double click on and sort of expand out. Shoot, what was it? I mean, you got so many things. I'll give you like one example. I don't want to take us too much off the side, but remember David Bohm during the peak of quantum mechanics, he uttered the metaphysics of quantum mechanics, the fundamental metaphysics of quantum mechanics, which was shut up and calculate. Meaning, don't tell any stories about what reality is here. Just do the math, because we don't fucking understand this. And we can't count every time we talk about quarks and we name quarks and we pretend like we think what we're doing, we know what we're doing. We're actually now creating an imaginal environment that is confusing, because it definitely isn't the reality that we're actually seeing when we do our experiments. Right? So, FYI, the story of the long term, the actual reality of the story of science as it has happened over the past, let's say, 250 years, has been uh, a in many ways a continuous process of the narrative that we have produced that somewhat reasonably fits the experimental data that we've been able to identify using instruments that were available, tends to be overturned and a new narrative is put in its place. Right? So the atom as a notion, the idea of the atom as this kind of a solar system, had to be shattered and replaced with a different image, and that had to be shattered and replaced with a different image. And there's no reason to believe that won't continue. So there's something about the relationship between narrative and the way that human beings, as finite beings, are capable of producing narratives, and the nature of reality, which may in fact not fit particularly well. And so our data will always shatter our narratives as we become more capable of different qualities of relationship. But notice that it's quality of relationships. So the next thing you said was that an atom is, let's say, useful. Well, the word useful is very loaded, because the word useful is always governed by values. Well, according to whose values are atoms useful? According to what values are atoms useful? One might say that, say, for example, nursing, the ability to nurse an infant, is really substantially more useful than an atom. Now, one might also say that I can think of milk and nursing using the logic of atoms, and this is Michael Levin does a really good job here. This would be a rather terrible way of trying to do so. Like it's exactly the wrong frame to use to try to kind of grab the value of this particular relationship. So if you pivot it towards, okay, we're thinking about relationships, values and relationships fit together quite nicely. Values now are more fundamental than the usefulness of anything. So we have to actually work our stack up and be actually in a very orderly way saying, okay, what are our values? What relationships do we value? In what relationships do we produce what values? Okay, now we're sitting at a substrate where we can put, say, atoms in their proper place and say, oh, okay, well, I do in fact feel like it's quite useful to produce energy. And I would like to be able to produce energy using nuclear power. So, okay, atoms are now useful. Nice, fun. We can we've now seen its proper location, but notice that it sits now in a hierarchy where it's actually rather subordinate, right? It's sitting actually pretty low on the stack, not high on the stack. And he said this thing like, I'd like science that can take us to the moon. Okay, well, neat. There's a whole hierarchy of values that leads us to the point where we consider that to be neato at all. Like any percent neato. Like, why would you consider that neato? What's going on there? Well, okay, there's a reason why. There's a whole bunch of really cool stories that we can tell about how we end up in a place where we can actually assign value more than zero to an adventure that leads people to go on the moon, which then that then provides a sense of usefulness to the science and technology that got us there, which differentiates it from sort of any arbitrary construct in the world. Right? So the values create the orienting basis for actually be able to say these various things. And values are a different kind of animal than what science deals with.
And when you have to look and ask, okay, it's cool that we can go to the moon, but why are you saying that's cool? What purpose does that serve? Even if and even though like technologically, okay, kind of it's some way obvious that it's impressive, but also in other senses, it depends what you mean by impressive. I mean, one thing I wanted to maybe even talk about on this question of why do something is the desire of why make AI. I mean, we talked about it a bit last time, but with artificial intelligence, in part, it's also kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. You like game theoretically, we can't let these other countries make the most powerful AI. Oh well, we better make the the most powerful AI, and we don't know what was going to happen now, but it's got to be done. And I mean, it might not be the right framing to ask why, as if someone is intending, we're going to start, because it's such a long history when we think about the intentions of why we want to make AI. I mean, I talked to a philosopher of neuroscience recently, and we talked about to what degree can the mind be fully explained in whatever terms you want to do that. But it's like, why does someone want to fully understand the mind, and is reality the kind of thing where the apparatus by which we understand the world is able to be completely propositionalized or just explained in parts that are smaller than, and because science is, I think about Stephen Wolfram recently. Science is those pockets of computational reducibility, the places where you can find, there's a pattern here. We don't need to have every single neuron in the brain. Like, we realize that these neurons do these kinds of things. There's that region of the brain. Therefore, we can make a scientific theory to sort of shorten this down and compact what we mean by the brain and the mind. But it's like, and then so partly kind of drawing on John Vervaeke is part of the reason why you want to make AI kind of part of cognitive science was to try and fully understand the mind. Part of doing that is to make AI. If you can make something, you can kind of understand it. But it's a weird one because, go on.
I would say something like 99.997% of why we make AI has nothing to do with understanding the mind. There's maybe a tiny portion of it. And we could talk about that separately, which is to say that there's a whole story of that, which has got its own intrinsics. But you gestured at it, but I think we could say it more fundamentally, which is at least within the realm of what's happening now, meaning the kind of AI and how, why are we making the kind of AI that we're making, and why are we making it the way that we're making it? The simple answer is that we are deeply committed Moloch cult. That's why. We are worshiping the demon Moloch. And as a consequence, there's a very large number of things that follow from that, which ultimately end up with us producing the kind of AI that we're producing in the way that we're producing it. So that's the answer. For the most part. Again, there's a small residuum of other things around the outside that aren't included in that, but that's the centerpiece.
Tell me about Moloch. What kind of thing are we doing? What entity are we serving? I was reading a book on egregores recently on the degree to which we can think about thought forms and groups of people as having a kind of agency over those people. It's something we talked about last time, and I mean, but I want to almost characterize. What is this personality that is Moloch?
Yeah. So there's, I think maybe 3 moves that can get us there nicely. So the first is, are you in proper relationship with reality? Are you in proper relationship with wholeness, with continuity? There's a whole bunch there. So if you'd like, we can spend some time there and explain what I mean. But just for the moment, let's just I'll do the first 3. So the second is if no, right? If the answer to that is no, that you're for some reason separated from wholeness, right? You're now standing separate from wholeness. You've experienced the fall. You experienced the fall from Genesis, the terribly useless book. You've experienced it. You're now standing separate. And the third is, but you want to find some way of producing a wholeness or something like that, to come back together, to bring the pieces back together, to produce something which has is larger than its parts and has strength and power to be able to maintain itself. And so, what is the archetype of Moloch? Moloch is, just think about the Carthaginians or the Canaanites, but we have the Carthaginians historically, so we can speak about them. When the city, to form a city, what is a city? A city is a multiplicity that's trying to come together into something like a unity, into a wholeness that has a capacity, a potency that allows it to maintain itself vis-a-vis sort of 3 basic threats. One threat is the Romans, right? Those who are outside of our city. Another threat is famine and pestilence, so something coming from the underneath. And the third is civil war, or us breaking apart, right? So you want to have the city brought together and against these basic forces. And how do you achieve it vis-a-vis Moloch? You sacrifice your children. That's how you do it. Right? So the symbol of Moloch, the archetype of Moloch, is a force that by means of child sacrifice produces a way of bringing a multiplicity into something like a simulation of a wholeness that has enough potency to maintain its integrity vis-a-vis the physical environment that it sits in, vis-a-vis adversaries from the outside, and vis-a-vis its own actual lack of being truly whole, like its own lack of integrity. So that's the next answer. That's like the next layer up. The answer to your question is who Moloch is as a figure. And if you zoom in on that, what you will see is that that's exactly what we are doing. We are doing that in absurd levels of terror. And to say that we are a Moloch cult, take what I just said and diagnose and say, yeah, I guess that's exactly what we do.
It's interesting because, as you say, listening to Jonathan Pageau talk about how, because sacrifice is a weird, you say sacrificing children, but it's interesting because, so on the first hand, sacrifice can work, right? Like if it's kind of a weird concept because it's such a, sacrifice is such a, doesn't make sense to us anymore. But like Jonathan Pageau had the example of these kind of terrorist groups where you tell one person, hey, you just jump off that cliff, die, and then in that person dying, killing themselves, it's like that group become bound and unified because it's like we had the power to do that. So in that person being excluded, we're more unified, and that's it's Rene Girard and the scapegoat mechanism. I mean, this happens constantly, right? Or even I think about
we can actually even make it more like prosaic, which is if you want to be good at sports, if you want to be strong, let's make it even very simple. If you want to be stronger, you must sacrifice. You must spend time doing something painful, lifting weights, so that you can get something that you value. In this case, getting stronger, right? So sacrifice doesn't just kind of work. Sacrifice is woven into the very fabric of reality. Nothing works without sacrifice.
I guess I wanted to. I think sometimes so Jordan Peterson really has that idea of like, I mean, in a way you can, in a fractal way, anything can kind of constitute sacrifice, and you can think about it like that. But in some ways, sometimes just thinking about sacrifice like that without realizing that in the fullest mode, sacrifice is death. It's giving something up without return, if that makes sense. I mean, because sometimes on the short level, you can kind of feel like a trade off, like kind of. I mean, I could do this thing, or I could, get stronger. I could, play some video games or whatever. But there's a kind of irreversibility to that can bind. I mean, it's just I feel like ultimately in say the Bible, sacrifice is like kind of having to give something up. I don't know. I mean,
I'm going to trade.
I just want.
So let's say maybe the point you're trying to hit on is that there's a different levels of profundity. Right? So if I'm making the trade off between having chocolate ice cream so that I can have vanilla ice cream, that doesn't feel profound. I mean, the reality is that moment, that exact moment, that exact specific moment of having chocolate ice cream is dead. It is gone for eternity, right? It's in the past that is irretrievable. It has been sacrificed on the altar of vanilla ice cream. But of course, tomorrow I could have chocolate ice cream, so it's relatively trivial as a sacrifice. But as a pattern, it's exactly the same as Christ on the cross, right? As a pattern, it's exactly the same as something that is no longer part of the possibility of reality, that is giving possibility back, right? That's the thing. I've traded this possibility for this possibility. It's only by virtue of this possibility not being part of reality that this possibility is part of reality. So that's the intrinsic. Now, the point you're kind of hitting on, which I think is just right, is okay, well, then let's put things in the proper order. Right? There are trivial sacrifices and there are profound or meaningful sacrifices. Absolutely. And then I would say, to kind of go back to the Moloch story, and then there are also proper sacrifices and there are improper sacrifices. Right? So if I sacrifice my child for my well-being, that is horror, right? That is profanity. That is evil, right? That is absolutely upside down. If, on the other hand, I, as a father, sacrifice my life to save my children, that is good, right? That is proper. That is healthy, right? That is just. And so there's two characteristics. There's the intensity or the meaningfulness of the sacrifice, and then there's the propriety of it or the orientation of it.
Right, and it's helpful, yeah, and it's helpful to make the point that there are degrees of sacrifice, but also to make the analogy that there is something essential to any kind of sacrifice, even if it is just time and attention and these small things in our life.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, I mean, again, I think about Richard Dawkins, and wow, it's amazing that we can go to the moon, but that's kind of like, but there's lots of things we could be doing, and it kind of I mean, especially because anytime you wanted, wanting to go to the moon, or Elon Musk now wanting to go to Mars, that kind of feels like a ritualized moment. Like if we get there, then that will kind of bind us. We'll have accomplished this amazing thing, and then we can kind of celebrate and go forward, having said that. Oh, like look what we're capable of, this pinnacle of achievement, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah, that's actually beautiful. That's, if you're familiar with, say, the mythology of the moon effort, so Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and you're familiar with these sacrifices, the many sacrifices of life, and I don't mean just necessarily death, people dying, which people did, but also just the amount of life energy, right? The amount of resources, the amount of time that were made to achieve something at profound risk. Like that's a really beautiful example of the point. And then, of course, by participating in that corporately, there is a binding strength. Right? This is very much Pageau. There's a symbolic thing, a symbolon to bring together, to bind. There's a symbolic potency of that event, which is a sacrifice and also is in a moment of communion. And it's, I think, in many ways proper. There's something about it that is not towards the profane. There's a reason why it continues to echo in our mythology. And the story then, to ping the string of Dawkins I'd ask is, okay, well, let's double click on why. Like, why is that proper as opposed to other things that we might have done with those same resources in life? And how do we know the difference? Like, how would that be? Why would one version of sacrifice be proper and the other one not be? Why are they just neutral or random? What's going on here? And there's something else that I thought would be maybe useful to bring up here, which is we have to be, I think, very careful because we live in a very subtle time. We live in a very spiritualized time. This is what I mean. The Canaanites sacrificed their children in a fashion that was extremely obvious. They literally took a physical infant and put it into a cauldron and burned it alive. So it's quite concrete, it's quite coarse grained, and it's quite acute. I mean, done. That, and just that child, by the way, just that one, or maybe 3 or 4. But the whole point is it's focused. Our world is a very different kind of world, right? In our world, it happens in the unconscious. It happens in the subtle. It happens in these little tiny bits. So instead of, say, take one child and put that child on the altar, we take all children and we separate them from meaningfulness. We take all children and we orient their attention to a less meaningful life. So we take a slice of everybody's life and just kind of dissolve it. And we don't even make it like, we don't we do incarcerate them at school, but we don't make it obvious that we're sort of taking them in, putting them in a locked room. We just have them do things that are less and less and less meaningful, and less capable of even knowing that the meaningfulness has been sucked out of life experience. And so if you sort of ran a calculus and said, okay, how many total human lives have been sacrificed on the altar of our indifference, the number would be rather extraordinary, but it's insidious because we can't quite notice it because it's been so distributed and so subtle.
I mean, I was rereading or rethinking about your article on simulated thinking when you bring up schools, because just because I mean I was talking with some friends recently of just, I don't want to insult people's thinking, but sometimes it's the kind of explanations you'll get for why one would want to do anything seem very like, why. I'll give an example. I mean, I don't know, if you're in a school and you're kind of, the thing you're being taught is, these countries have these capital cities, and you become a kind of dictionary to draw from kind of the right appropriate correspondence in this very trivial, low dimensional thing of importance. Like, it's not bad to know some facts, but it then kind of feels like when you replace that with real thinking, and it might be helpful if you were to talk about a bit more about this simulated versus real thinking. It kind of sometimes feels a bit like a ritual sacrifice in learning these facts. You're kind of going, pronouncing, oh, these are the things I know, and it becomes very static and dead. But you've put your mind and your attention to these things above other things, and now you have them, yes, but what is learning and education supposed to be for, right? And
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because in a certain particular way, you've actually sacrificed your soul. So let's. What do I mean by that? I think a simple, in some sense, classic example would be just rote arithmetic. So 2 + 2 = 4, or I don't know, 8 × 8 = 64. Math multiplication is a little bit more. People remember that because it's a little bit more difficult, like to remember math works or multiplication works. So here's the thing, and this goes back to the notion of insidiousness and sort of the problematique. And I should mention, by the way, just so I have completeness, we're a Moloch cult and we're also a Mammon cult. And those are different, but they work really nice. They're buddies. Okay, so you can absolutely successfully impress upon the habit mind of a mass of children the functional capacity to do their multiplication tables with some significant degree of reliability. Obviously things like IQ and et cetera range into that, but you can sort of accomplish that task. This is an industrial process. You can identify a useful thing, by the way, right? You can narrow band, identify a useful thing. I want to accomplish this task, this metric. I want to get that number to go up. And then you can produce an industrial process that successfully gets that number to go up. Now, here's the basic problem. You've actually inverted math. You've inverted things. The point is, what's the point? What's the meaningfulness of 8 × 8? And I don't mean that just in terms of like, what do I use it for in life? Like, what's it actually mean? The example that really landed it for me was to recognize Steiner when he was doing Waldorf. The way he teaches basic math is you have the experience of, say, a ball of clay, and then you tear the ball of clay into 2 pieces. And you actually notice that this idea of division really actually means a physical process of converting something, like actually separating parts apart. And it's grounded in reality. Right? It's actually back into reality. You're not living in a habit, which is a pure, propositional calculation machine. You're actually living in embodied experiential reality and noticing that this function of division is a real process. And then I can use symbolic functions to be able to make that easier to do. Yeah. For purposes. I can apply purposes to it and I can make it easier to do. It's a technology I can apply. But I'm not separating the technology from its grounding in reality. I'm allowing reality to settle first so I really get it. And here's the point. In my soul, like where you actually get reality, where you actually learn how to be in relationship with reality and kind of come into conformity with it, to grasp it, to feel it, to apply values to it, to value it well and properly, is the soul. That's what the soul does. And then the mind is properly placed, probably on the left side of the throne, to go out and accomplish missions as governed by the soul. And I say, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to take these, I don't know, whatever, eggs and divide the 12 into 2 groups of how many? Oh, 6. Okay, great. Right. And your mind can help you accomplish that. But the mind is not the thing that is governing values or engaging with reality. It's simply allowing a functional process, which is what machines do well. So the point is that simulated thinking is converting a human being into a mediocre calculating machine, or a mediocre machine in general. And then just iterate at that constantly, right? Just iterate over and over and over again the notion of modeling and emulation, the notion of authority. It's proper and good for human beings to orient towards authority because that's how we can learn things well. That person knows how to play basketball. I will watch that person's basketball playing and I will learn more how to play basketball. One of the things that happens in our educational system is we take the function of authority that is real and useful and we attach it to someone who has no real authority. Zach Stein calls this teacherly authority. And then we then use that stolen authority, that usurped authority, to impress upon people something that is turning them again into a mediocre machine. So now I'm spewing facts at you. I don't know why I give a fuck about any of this, but you're an authority, and so I care enough to do the work. And then you give me a code that says, I'm going to spew a bunch of facts at you. Let's just go with capitals of do you do this in England? Like major cities in England. Kings. Let's go with kings. The kings of England. I'm going to spew a bunch of facts at you, utterly decontextualized from anything meaningful at all. Right? Your own life first and foremost, right? And then the way that you're going to be able to check the box of what your system is telling you is right relationship with authority. I'm going to give you a way of doing that, which is called a test, right? So see what's happening. I'm producing what is effectively a kind of a spell, like I'm a sort of sorcery that grabs things from their real lived context that have use. They're, how do I say it? They're properly useful for reasons like authority, like orientation towards authority. I'm decontextualizing them. I'm converting them into a tool to produce a desired result that is utterly separated from its larger lived context and has as a secondary effect, or maybe even a primary effect, of separating the human being from themselves so that they less and less and less are capable of actually living life in reality, and maybe are more and more capable of being mediocre machines, responding with the appropriate facts. And so when you engage in a conversation with somebody who's been subjected to this for a very long time, there's a very good reason why they can't actually respond well to the questions that you're asking. It's because they've spent the last 20 or 30 years not being capable of actually being humans. They've been turned into mediocre machines and they don't even know the difference anymore.
I think AI is relevant here for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is AI as kind of huge parameters that can capture the text, the facts that have been put out already on the internet. It can kind of do simulated thinking really well, and but then it's. I'm happy to see if it can really creatively solve problems. I mean, give it to me if that's there. But it's kind of like, if it doesn't do that, if it kind of, which I've been talking to people who are AI experts and just thinking about the biology of intelligence and the degree to which you can capture that based on just essentially, overfitting incredibly well and then sort of using humans to kind of push it towards answers that feel reasonable to us. I don't want to denigrate it, but I'm just curious about what then the purpose of AI is, why we'd want to make it, in the sense of it doesn't feel like it can solve. Like, if I'm talking with a human being and I have a really difficult problem to solve, I can think about it all in my head a lot. But when I actually talk with a human being really capable of the understanding the problem, I can kind of have insights that I couldn't imagine that I could have had that idea. Okay, I better understand the situation I'm in. It's you kind of get that sophistication and profundity of, you can solve vaster problems. I'm being vague here, but what I kind of mean is, if you have AI intelligence and you kind of have more power to solve problems, that you can write text more easily, you can find all the little pieces of details more easily, you can write all the code you want more easily, but you don't have that kind of communion and communication with someone else, such that you can. So yeah, you kind of, on one scale level, you have more power to solve problems, but on another level, if you, yeah, because
Let's just use some of the concepts we've worked with so far to see if that may be helpful. So AI, and but specifically we're talking about effectively large language models and machine learning more broadly. The word power is just right. And maybe a really good way of putting it is that it's increases your power to answer questions and solve problems, but it doesn't really do a great job of increasing your capacity to ask meaningful questions. Those are very different orders of things. Right? Whence the depth of a meaningful question. It's actually really terrible at that. Now, it can produce other people's, this is important, this is the simulated thinking piece. AI can replicate other people's questions and in some sense, therefore provoke in you something that will give you a deeper sense. But as you say, it's when you're in relationship with another human, that there's something going on that produces a deepening, right? A capacity to actually have a more profound relationship with reality, and therefore a deeper curiosity, and also an expanded capacity to even inquire, right? It's not that your curiosity is more keen, like it's not energetically increased. It's rather you can perceive things that you could not perceive before. Right. So it's like, in the context of AI, it's in some sense kind of like a really big search engine, like a really powerful, fluid, fine-grained search engine. So that would, if you are searching, right, if you're looking for something that is, if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, you will be better at finding a needle in a haystack. Right? But if you're trying to create, or if you're endeavoring to relate, right? Those are two different modes, right? Create, relate, and search. If you're endeavoring to create or relate, it will not help at all. Oh, well, that's not right. It will not help in the same way that a human helps. It can help by provoking you and shaking things up, and because it is so vast that you will find yourself, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and it can help, and it's I think what I've been thinking about is then it though requires values and aims to for what you want to go and do with that, and that's why it then makes me want to go back and be like, okay, then why the AI? Why make it? Because if I mean, it's interesting as well because if you have people who, to the degree that we replace real thinking with simulated thinking, you can then also replace AI with people, if that's all people can do, and then you kind of, uh, in that sense, yeah, you know, and I don't know
So,
where I'm
so
going,
just a,
but
just
it's
a trick. Step one, convert people into mediocre machines. Step two, produce really good machines and replace mediocre machines that used to be people. Kind of like that.
yeah, yeah. I
Now, what we'd like to do, we could flip it around. So we've talked about the profane, right? So the Moloch Mammon driver, but we're not limited to that. We can, in fact, expand beyond that and have a properly valued, properly orientation towards AI. And one piece of that would, in fact, be to say, no, let us liberate people from being mediocre machines back into being people. Right? Maybe there's was a reason why we had to convert people into. By the way, remember during the industrial age, we converted people into physical cogs. Like we actually, there's a reason why we use the metaphor of you're just a cog in a machine. It's because we actually needed to use the physical body as just an actuator because we couldn't quite develop sophisticated enough robots. And so we did the same thing with the mind, right? We converted the mind into a mediocre calculator. So maybe we can liberate people away from that. We can maintain something of value in what has happened as a consequence of the industrial arc, and hopefully radically eliminate the things that are not of value. And there's a lot of them. Many of them are spiritual. But maintain something of value from that, and also liberate people from that position back into the fundamental problem of how do you actually human in this world.
I mean, I think it relates to what I was talking about with science and what academia kind of is, and I'm just thinking about how many papers there are on so many different topics, and then talking to people about, oh, it kind of feels like we've exhausted some area, like the low-hanging fruit has been taken, and there's only incremental improvements to be made, and that's where I kind of feel like science is short-term in the sense that, like, what does it mean to say, if you're telling me there's only incremental improvements to be made, like I'm out. In the sense that what problems are you looking at, or what is your framing such that you what I mean is, you've kind of intellectualized a lot of areas such that given good theories, and then you're able to kind of flesh them out in more and more detail. But where is the capacity to flip round and sort of break down that whole theory, or not even that you need to break down theories, but rather can you have capacity such that you can kind of see when that theory is or is not useful? And sometimes I think about like what even would the almost opposite number of academia, but that's not for, you need these very long term, we get to the bottom of what quarks are, and we get very fine details on things, but also how we even have generative, creative kinds of institutions in our world today.
Well, and you should connect to that. So let's just connect those two pieces together, because I noticed. So let's say by hypothesis that we get very fine grained, detailed information on something about quarks. Okay. The long termedness of that is entirely contingent upon the degree to which our culture survives. Right. So if we self extinguish, then this
Yeah.
information that we've held so precious isn't actually very long term at all. And we could, by the way, self extinguish tomorrow if things get very choppy over in the Ukraine. So I don't suspect we will, but we could, right? Because we live on a knife's edge, and we have been living that way for about a century. So this is critical because this actually orients towards, well, what's more fundamental than knowing how to get to the moon? Well, what's more fundamental is maintaining the capacity to know how to do that for a long time for a lot of people. FYI, like that's just even it's just that level of analysis. That's true.
well, that insight is really helpful because I think that's kind of what I mean by it being maybe even short time to me. Short term is the wrong word, but there's some way in which it needs to be appropriately incorporated with a kind of living dynamic capacity to solve problems. Otherwise, yeah, it's not going to be very useful to have all this incredibly detailed knowledge about physics if you can't implement it for appropriate aims and values, because yeah, it's, or it's collapsed, or
even if
you know
people are like killing themselves because they have no desire to live, or killing themselves insidiously because their will to live is yoked to sheer salience, or killing each other because their will to live is yoked to the more intense need or desire to externalize that felt sense of lack of meaningfulness, which of course is characteristic of the world we live in. So it's not just like maintaining the vitality. It is very much necessary for us to maintain the vitality of thinking rather than simulated thinking. Like that's a trap that we've gotten ourselves into. We need to get escape from that. But thinking is also then ultimately grounded in living, and living is more fundamental than thinking. Like thinking serves living, not the other way around. And and that, right, now we have to go one more level of profundity. All of that then ultimately is set in this notion of the inverted or properly oriented values hierarchy. And so if you say, hey, wait a minute, simulated thinking serves thinking, and thinking serves living, and living is, this whole fact is embedded in the reality that there's actually something like a proper orientation. And so living has to be properly oriented, which is to say living has to serve proper orientation, something like that, or at least living serves in the sense of sacrifice, and sacrifice has to be proper sacrifice. Now things get really interesting and rich, and by the way, reconnected. And now we can begin to move in a how do you say, in a live direction.
Right. I mean, it's like living life is really important. And you can think about, well, is that the ultimate thing, But then it kind of has a capacity, if you say life is the ultimate thing, to then start breaking down and be like, well, what created life? And this, recursion down to Dawkins' genes, or, something lower than that. Because it reminds me of Jonathan Pageau talking about Jack and the Beanstalk story of, like, the cow is really important. It's actually the most important thing that they have, but it's sold for a bean, and and it's
Magic
because
beans.
we need magic beans, yeah, And if you're with those, you get a beanstalk, and you can get things that create cows and create the things that create
I
cows.
want to actually point something out that you did there, because I think it's a very you did it. You actually expressed it. So life, he said, okay, so life is the most important thing by hypothesis. So what created life? And then you get back. That you actually made a very, very critical move right there. What you did is you actually made the meaningfulness of life subject to your ability to think about it. Does that make sense? You actually subtly subordinated life to thinking. It's only to the degree to which I can actually, let's say, tell a story about the meaningful of life that I can understand. I can stand under life. Well, what just happened? Mind put itself under life, is saying, well, okay, hold on. As it turns out, I'm subtly more fundamental. So it's not actually an analytic process of establishing this hierarchy. Once you recognize that you have to go from simulated thinking to living, you don't go deeper than living by virtue of thinking about it. Right? You go deeper than living by virtue of living it and noticing in the process of living, is there something that is deeper than that? And the answer, by the way, is yes. When you live properly, you begin to notice that there is something about a depth that supports living. And in the Christian world, we would call that faith. But faith, I've said this on many different podcasts, but obviously my saying it doesn't change it in the proper vernacular. Faith has been brutally defamed, or to put it in the language we've been using here, has been inverted or decontextualized and reversed. So faith maybe is a word that we use to describe that which subtends living. And then, by the way, hope subtends faith, and love subtends hope. And there is nothing below that.
So if we have, it's interesting because you can't. Life is kind of the obvious. This is so. I was listening to Stephen Wolfram and Yudkowsky. It's sort of
Eliezer?
AI.
Oh,
Yeah,
man, that sounds like a crazy conversation.
It was 4 hours long. You should watch it. I'll send it to you.
Not a chance. I'll ask ChatGPT to give me a summary.
Okay, that'll be the same. Yeah, because well, one thing Wolfram, or maybe both of them, yeah. So Yudkowsky would do is kind of go, well, I don't know exactly what we want, but I think what we can all agree on is we want human consciousness to go forward into the future. So it would be really bad if the AI killed us all. And I agree, but also it feels a bit like when you say human consciousness is the thing we need to preserve, it feels a bit like a postponement of what is actually important, in the sense that you can kind of go, yeah, I mean, but to what end human consciousness, because, and then Wolfram was kind of pointing, but why human consciousness then, you have not that good a reason, and then and orientation for you to say that, and that's why you kind of don't have to point upwards, but to something that.
So the image that just came to my mind that made me laugh is that as I'm imagining this scene of them talking, what I'm imagining is I'm seeing a bunch of chimpanzees trying to hammer in a nail with a screwdriver. And they may be really, really clever chimpanzees who've gotten reasonably good at hammering a nail with a screwdriver. But it ain't the right tool. The tool they're endeavoring to use is the wrong tool. That's the problem. The entire frame, the existential frame, like the disposition to reality that they are using to address the inquiry, is completely the wrong one. And this is one of the reasons why, A, it seems so absurd, and B, it throws so many weird results. Like, just like you.
Right.
By the way, if you're trying to stab the screwdriver down under the nail, you get power by doing that, but it's really hard to hit the nail. Whereas if you're trying to like tap the top of the screwdriver against the nail, you get no power, but it's a little bit. What the fuck? Like, who's debating? And now we're separating into two clans. You got the stab clan and the tap clan, both of which are completely off the entire point, which is that you need a hammer.
Yeah. One thing I thought, listening to your conversations with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau, was because, one thing we can talk about is, does one, to what degree do we need to debate the utility of Christianity or religions in general? Like, and this kind of relates to what we're talking about, in the sense of, we can have these propositional debates of people need to, this way of thinking is optimal, but to what degree is this? I mean, it kind of relates to John Vervaeke's project of, sometimes you don't need to keep thinking about what is the optimal religion or way of being, because there are, if people can get back to the religions or communities that they were already in and lived through, like, maybe sometimes I think with John Vervaeke's thought of a philosophical Silk Road and ways of people going back to their own religions, it's kind of like sometimes you need to get back to that first before, even if you wanted to, not that you need to go to Christianity like it's the ultimate religion, although in a sense, if you are a Christian, you might have to kind of say that, but it's kind of like, what is the...
No, actually.
Because the reason I'm saying this is kind of like, as you say with the understanding about quarks, and what usefulness is it if we know all this, but then we'll die. Similarly, on a more practical basis, how can we get people, like, in a reciprocal, step-by-step process to relate and then and live better, and then once they do that, that can open up capacities for solving problems.
Okay. So
you don't need to solve the whole thing at the same. The problems we face in the world are very deep and problematic, but then also they're sometimes, maybe, I don't want to say the word easier than you think, in the sense that once you make some progress, you realize, oh, I see ways this can be solved.
Mm-hmm.
But you can only do that through, I don't know, the right orientation or the right meta problems being solved, and then you kind of see how things unfold.
Our monkeys or chimpanzees. So the phrase, debate the utility of Christianity, I think was the phrase you used. So this is a little bit like saying we should boxing match our way into proper childcare. Does that make any sense, what I'm saying there? The tool of debate is antithetical to the nature of the thing that you're actually trying to accomplish. It's not the right way of doing anything of this sort. At this moment in time, I don't think we really need to debate much of anything. Debate is a useful tool, but it's not useful for things like collaboration in the context we're in. It could be used as a subset of that to sharpen things. So, but John has proposed dialogos. And by the way, dialogos is not exactly the same thing as dialogue. So we got debate, dialogue, dialogos. Debate, we're doing this, right? And we're largely, the best thing that comes out of this is that both sides get sharper, which is nice. That's a fine thing. Dialogue, we're doing sort of this. So what happens there is that pieces are being put together and things are crossing over more fluidly. In dialogos, we're doing this. We are first and foremost entering into communion. This is what you're saying in terms of what happens with a human. We're entering into a relationship where we as a multiplicity are becoming a unity. That unity actually expands new affordances that were not available in either the previous two individuals. In dialogue, the two individuals are exchanging material or capabilities or insight. In dialogos, they are literally becoming a new kind of being that has new total capacities in reality, which expands, therefore, the volume of reality with which they can engage properly. They can do things that will look actually impossible in the previous ontology. So we don't debate, we dialogos. Okay. Second, it would be, some Christians might say that Christianity is the ultimate religion, but that's wrong. That's just a simple way of putting it. Schmemann, who I think is a truly beautiful and brilliant theologian from the Orthodox lineage, quite specifically says that no. To follow the way of Christ, so I'm going to separate it from the notion of Christianity just to make the distinction, is anti-religion. It's not the ultimate religion, it's the exact opposite of religion. And that religion is actually very close to the secular world. Like secular and religion are roughly the same kind of thing, whereas to follow the way of Christ is not that kind of thing at all. So, and to follow the way of Christ is of the category of dialogos, whereas religion is maybe of the category of debate or war, if you'd like, and the secular, right? The best of the seculars are the category of dialogue at its best, because you can exchange. Like in liberalism, the whole point is we can sort of exchange. But the problem with liberalism is it actually prevents us from being able to enter into dialogos, and so it collapses on its own terms in a finite time.
Well, go on.
No, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting because I framed it as, religions facing off against each other, but I talked to one philosopher recently about the weirdness of even the concept of religion. Like, what do we mean by that? As if it's like only once you can like step away from it and see multiple things, and you want to go, oh, maybe we can have the category religion and point to all of them, as if it makes any sense for, I don't know, these kind of worldviews. If you're in a religion and living in that fashion, it's not like you'd ever call that a religion that you can point to. It's out of it, because the word religion kind of points to something that can be in distinction to other ones. But if it's a way of living, it's not something that can be replaced. Oh, we found a better one. We debated the utility of Christianity and we kind of moved to this other one which is better. It's kind of you'd have to it's that because that debate would have to take place in a realm by which debates are facilitated, and humans are invited to debate, and all these other things higher order to debating that. Yeah. And why did I bring that up? So,
well, yeah, but just to kind of, so we've got words like philosophy, and we also have words like ideology, and then we have ways of life, and those aren't the same kinds of things. Philosophy and ideology are much more akin, but not necessarily. In some sense, one might say, what is your philosophy, in the sense of what is your way of life? And that's just an ambiguity problem. The word means different kinds of things. But when we say, like, if you look at the etymology of religion, religio, right? It is an effort to produce, by means of things that we can reliably accomplish, a reconnection between the finite and the infinite, between us and the other. So dialogos is a kind of religio in that sense. Dialogos is a technique, a practice that allows us to come into a form of connection. But the key thing is we don't want to do two things. We don't want to reify the thing we're trying to accomplish with the means, right? So you don't want to say, okay, Dialogos is the thing. The practice of Dialogos is not the thing, but the actual coming into connection is the thing. And Dialogos facilitates that. So we're allowing that to be a proper tool and not to have it become a value. And we definitely don't want to have the story that we tell about the practice become the thing, right? That's where we say, okay, this practice sits within a narrative that we, for some reason, have become very attached to. And then what happens is we don't even properly execute on the practice because we no longer actually get to the thing. We're now living in the story that we tell about the practice, or maybe the story that we tell about the thing, and which separates us from the thing. Right? So we don't want to do that. And then the last thing we don't want to do is we don't want to fight with each other about the thing, the narrative, that separates us from the thing. And so when I say that Christianity is an anti-religion, what I'm saying is Christianity, or following the way of Christ, is an anti-religion. That is the thing. And that as you go further and further down this stack, you end up getting further and further from the thing. And then you actually will get into conflict with other people because you're simulated thinking, right? That actually is the proper, you're living in the simulated thinking world where you mistake debate for Dialogos, for example.
It's interesting that you would separate the way of Christ from Christianity because sometimes the way it's been instantiated in institutions in our past, I mean, sometimes they've been inadequate. Like I've been thinking about how I remember my parents talking about this kind of funny thing where everyone would go to church. So that's kind of, in a sense, if you think Christianity is the way one should live their life, that's better than not people, church attendance falling in the modern world. So everyone's going to church, but then it would they do it in a way in which they made a joke. They like it when the pastor, this is the pastor who, does the fastest, quickest sermons, and we can all leave, it's like, oh, please. And that's then the thing that binds, it's like, so, I mean, it's not, yeah, again, you have to think about goods. It's good that they're being bound together, but then if it's sometimes it's interesting. I mean, it just, whatever. I mean, I would be interested in, I wonder what it was like in that kind of, and there's probably churches like that in the world today where, I mean, and sometimes, I mean, in every level of analysis, I mean, there's also times when you're in church, you're like, oh, this is a bit boring. Sometimes, or this could be better. I could imagine better.
No. Okay, I good. So let me give it back to you. So, the thing. What is the thing? The thing is being in the presence of God, which is to say, being in relationship with God. That's the thing. We're endeavoring, yearning to more and more deeply, more and more fully, and more continuously be in the presence of God. Oh, okay. Well, how do we do that? Sing together and with songs that are about, deeply connected to Scripture. Okay, neat. Well, what if the song doesn't bring me to the presence of God? What if I sing routinely in the song? Then it's not working. That's the problem. Okay, a pastor, who the notion of preach, a pastor who again is using a particular technique to bring us into a relationship with God. If it's boring, it's not about the thing the performance he's making. It's about the fact that for some reason you have not come into relationship with God. So it's not about being entertained by it. That's a terrible, that's going down the slope in the terrible direction. What you want to say is, something is this, the thing is the practice is somehow lacking. I am somehow lacking the ability to utilize this practice to do the thing it's supposed to do, which is to bring me to the presence of God and deepen my relationship with God. So again, don't attach yourself, A, to the practice. B, do not attach yourself to the practice, because what happens when you attach yourself to the practice, what then happens is you then begin to look for the hit from the practice, the salience. Oh, I feel like I'm singing, worshiping, and I feel really overwhelmed. Nice, that feeling's great. If the feeling is the thing you're focusing on, you're missing the point. The point is, in fact, are you in the presence of God? Are you building a relationship with God? And you can keep doing that. You can keep doing that over and over again. So this is the point. And a narrative that came into my mind is funny. It landed on me when I was reading, I think it was Exodus. I can't remember, either Exodus or Judges. I'm sorry, Christians. My scholarly work is pretty weak. But it's famous, right? It's the famous worshiping of the golden calf, right? So the Israelites have been liberated from 400 years of slavery. They've been witness to all these plagues. They've been witness to the parting of the Red Sea. They've been witness to countless, just straight up massive miracles, completely shaken their entire lives. And Moses leaves, goes up the mountaintop, and I don't know, 33 seconds later, they're worshiping a golden calf, right? Now, my first order response is who the fuck is wrong with these guys? But the second order response is, oh, you think things have changed? Right? You think we don't do that instantaneously? Like as the second we actually the second that the God is not the energy of the prophet is not right on us, we don't immediately go back to worshiping golden calves. Of course we do. That's the point of the story, is to remind us of the fact that we're truly shitty at this, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why we're not going to be doing it on our own. But that's important to keep in mind, right? The fact that our institutional forms, the things that we call religions, right, the practices and the narratives and the organizations that we have repeatedly produced over time, oftentimes suck. That's not surprising. Like, we suck at this. We fail at this constantly, all over the place. And so that fact isn't surprising. The fact that it works at all ever is wildly surprising. And the fact that we actually can do it sometimes reasonably well is incredibly encouraging. And so then we get to move back. That's a reciprocal opening. We can move back up. But we shouldn't go like, oh man, sometimes church doesn't work, or sometimes churches have done terrible things, and go like, oh, let's throw the entire kindergarten out with the bathwater. It's like, no, this is the story, and we're in the middle of that story, and the proper process is to figure out how to separate the wheat from the chaff.
And one thing that's interesting is that we get wrapped up in the worship of golden calves such that we can't extricate ourselves from it. So it's like in this fractal level where there's always tiny little, what I mean is, we talked about AI, right? Or Mammon as well, the god of the economy. I heard, who was it? Kingsnorth, talking about the economy is something we worship, right? And it's not, if it and if it fails, then things will be really bad in the real world. Like, so we don't want to face that. So just make sure that it's okay and the economy is all good, and we need to do these payments, or this firm, these banks need to be given money or whatever. And the thing is that it works, and it's some ways necessary, because I'm not criticizing the economy or
never worship Mammon, but okay. So first, never worship Mammon, and the economy is necessary. That's okay. We can separate those two, because the point has to do with proper order and proper relationship, just like we were doing with everything else. Like, if as soon as you say, okay, the economy is a function, it has a place, it sits right about here, it's actually pretty good. Like, it's pretty important. Food is important. Houses are important. Energy is important. I can tell you first person. Suddenly move housing, food, energy, and water out of your life. You're like, man, that's actually quite important. But it's not the top of the stack, right? It's not the highest. And so you put it in its proper location. You subordinate it to the things that are higher. You make it functional. Okay, cool. Now we're good. And that's the opposite of worshiping Mammon.
Right. Because I mean that's, I don't know if there won't be any one solution to this, but it's also like you talked about reciprocal opening. I mean, I sometimes think about what would it look like to slowly unravel yourself from the worship of the likes of Mammon, because again, we can't just throw it away, because again, when you start worshiping something, it also has a hold over you, right? And then that becomes part of you, and so you need to be careful with discarding that. But it's also like,
well, I'll give you a concrete example. And this is a very simple example. Let's say that you are, let's say by really incredible blessings, you're part of a loving family. You've got 4 or 5 siblings, a bunch of cousins, aunts and uncles, and they all kind of live in roughly the same community. So you're part of a loving family, and you spend a lot of time with your loving family. And by the way, you have a lovely community. So many other people in the community have similar loving families, and they all live well, and it's a beautiful place to live. Okay. And you're offered a job in a faraway city that makes more money, a lot more money. Say 3 times as much money. What are you going to sacrifice? What are you going to put on the altar? If you choose to leave and live in this other place to make more money, you're sacrificing a lot. You don't maybe know how much you're sacrificing, because oftentimes we take things for granted, but you're sacrificing a lot, and you're sacrificing the most valuable stuff. To have been gifted something like that is tremendous. Now, if you're wise or careful, this might be more of a treasure hunt. Like, you might take I will go for 3 years. I will go for 4 years. I will go gather the treasure and bring it back. Okay, well, that's a different story. But if you unconsciously allow your choices to be governed by making more money, and devalue the truly valuable, that's worshiping mammon. That's to say, you're allowing yourself to be governed by his values, not your values.
And I find it interesting, and I wonder what your experience is when I think about doing anything because I need to do that because that would maybe earn me more money or that or just any end like that would, for example, I think about my podcast. But should I get that kind of guest on because they would maybe get more views? And anytime I do that, I'm like, this is maybe that is a consideration. I mean, don't just want to get like your uncle on or your friend who knows nothing. Like it's like you made a thing and you have certain kinds of people you have on and some people you don't. But then anytime that becomes the aim, you kind of go, I mean, that's probably going to be a sucky podcast.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing I truly want to ask to that person, I don't want to find out. And
nice.
And so in these small. I mean, on that level, I mean, there's like leniency, and then if you make these small decisions, then sometimes you can kind of come back from it or realize, oh, I did that podcast, it just wasn't even that fun. Why did I do that? But then there's a way in which if you keep doing that, and then it kind of has a hold over you, and you kind of don't realize what you've done. That wait, now I made a podcast, and it's and it kind of you focus on the money, but then it kind of it doesn't. You actually just not have money in the end anyway because your podcast sucks and no one wants to watch it because you made podcasts which weren't fun.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. You sell your soul to the devil. He's tricky. It's a tricky business because he'll give you what he keeps his promises. Right? He'll give you what you ask for, but he knows that what you ask for is sterile. It's not fruitful. Right? So you get the word that the distinction is between the Latin opulare and abundare. So opulare is a word that means like having a lot of grain. So you have a stock of something that is needful. You have a lot of it. And then abundare means like having a plentiful spring, like a spring that has a lot of fresh water coming out of it. Notice the difference between stock and flow. And what happens with opulare, which is the root of opulence, is as you consume it, it goes away, it depletes. And if you invite more people to consume it, it will simply deplete faster. Right? So you've got a bunch of really interesting, you've got a scarcity mentality even when you have opulare. And you have a sense of rivalry even when you have opulare, because the essence of it is that it is scarce, right? It's that kind of thing, even though you have a lot of it. When you have abundare, the water is just going to be coming. So once you've had your fill, there's no point in not inviting other people. In fact, it becomes powerful because when you invite other people, you're creating relationships. At the very least, there are people who are grateful that you let them drink water, and they may be able to help you in other contexts, right? But there's more things that can happen. And so abundare invites you into weaving together more, and opulare invites you into separation and rivalry. Yeah. And so and then, of course, you can get these downward spirals, right? So there's a sterility of opulare. So when you're making your decisions on the basis of, let's just go with views or likes, I'm going to get the number up of views and likes. You're moving to a certain opulence. Like you have a lot of something, but it's not alive, right? As you say, it's not aliveness is not governing it. It's an ability it's a deadness. It's an opulence. You have an opulent podcast. And because it's opulent, it is ultimately sterile, and therefore it is ultimately doomed. It will die, usually grotesquely, by the way. By contrast, if you have something which is alive, even though it may not look anywhere near as interesting from the point of view of like objective metric, but the aliveness is intense, it will grow, right? It will bear fruit. It will flourish. And maybe flourishing in ways that never show up as impressive on metrics. Maybe all that happens is it introduces you to the love of your life and you form a wonderful family and have wonderful children and never get 10 million viewers, right? Who gives a fuck about 10 million viewers when you've accomplished the huge win in life? So abundare is a completely different sensibility and how to govern these kinds of things. Okay.
And it reminds me of simulated thinking. And imagine, I notice it myself. If you learn so many facts and and wrote memorization and or even not memorization even, but just ways of gaming tests and or you kind of think that's the way of learning, then you have all this stock of knowledge, but then you actually, I don't know, you can't have creative new insights or ideas about how to
Hold on one second. Yes. All right. You may have to edit that out. Go ahead.
That's all right. We'll end it in like 5 minutes.
Okay.
What was I saying? It's simulated thinking. Yeah. In my own experience, and I'm noticing other people, then there's a way in which you actually can't kind of translate all the knowledge you have to something new, because you can answer any question someone asks you about the things you have, knowledge you have, but there's a way in which and you kind of you're trying to come with an idea for what is a new problem I could solve, what is a research paper I could create, but I don't know what it's a much deeper skill.
It's actually very easy, which is it's because it's not yours. Right? You're using somebody else's. You've been it's stolen actually, but you've maybe been granted, but probably have stolen somebody else's knowledge, and you've converted it into something that you can manipulate. Right? You can use it, but it's not yours. And this is that again back to that notion of the soul. Like you have not ensouled it. It is not woven into your identity. It is not woven into your being. It is not woven into your lived experience. Once it is woven into your lived experience, the propositional begins to dissolve away. And the essential elements that the propositional have given you connection to are now part of your life. They're part of your faith. They're part of your reality, the way that you can live life well. And from that, you can now, of course, you can be quite innovative. You can be quite creative with that, and you can play with it, move it around. You could do you could create metaphors, right? You can transcend. You can move it out of its one schema and notice that there's patterns that are sharing in different schema. So this is again that same basic idea, is that the ensoulment of something, or the ingestion of it, the metabolism of it, the conversion of it into your life in a way that deepens who you are, not what you know, but who you are, then allows you to be in relationship with the informational in a completely different fashion.
And again, I mean, ultimately, you talked about people like Zach Stein. I mean, I ultimately wonder what a world where there's less simulated thinking is, like the kinds of people, the kinds of institutions we could have to solve problems. And because I think the last time we talked about even climate change, and you go, CO2 is the baddie, and therefore, like, if we get CO2 down, then the problem solved. And it's like, maybe it's a problem, probably is to a degree, but then we have to debate to what degree, and to what values do we have, such that we need to frame what kind of problem we have, or the multiple problems we have, and how do we balance them with other multifarious problems we have in the world. And it's kind of completely
we have like a quadrillion interlocking problems, each of which are complexly related with each other. The notion, if we're going to identify one of them in the simplest possible way and just have that number go down, that's going to solve anything, is naive, right? It's childish. It's weird that that's actually a thing that pseudo-serious people utter publicly without being ashamed of themselves.
Do you have any final comments, or any what are you doing in the future? Tell me as you close this off.
I never have any idea what I'm doing in the future. I barely even plan ahead anymore. I'm just hopefully continue to be a father. I love being a dad, and with any luck, my children will continue to invite me to do so. Love being a husband. I love living in my community. I would love to help my community rebuild in a beautiful way. So I expect that will be stuff, but things constantly come my way, and some of them are interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's been great.
All right.